Heads up everybody, there's going to be Japanese pronunciations in this one. I'm not Japanese. I don't always get it 100% right. I do try though. Let's get into it. On March the 20th, 1995, 5 members of Japan's Aum Shinrikyo cult boarded the Tokyo subway in the middle of rush hour. At 8 a.m. they punctured bags of sarin, releasing a deadly cloud of nerve gas into the crowded trains. Commuters were blinded, racked with spasms. Some choked to death on their own blood. Trapped underground with nowhere to run, some 6,000 people were gassed that bright spring day, and 13 of them died. The attack was ordered by Aum's founder, yoga instructor Shoko Asahara. A blind mystic, Asahara had leveraged his intense personal charisma into massive wealth, creating a religious empire worth $1 billion. But where most evangelists use their money to build churches, Asahara used his to build an army. Under his watch, Aum stockpiled chemical weapons, they bred deadly viruses, they infiltrated the Japanese authorities, purchasing attack helicopters, building weapons of mass destruction, and drawing up plans to destroy the world. They were the single most ambitious cult that has ever existed, and they committed all of their crimes while hiding in plain sight. In the video today, the remarkable story of the man who nearly brought about Armageddon. One of the overriding features of these videos is just how many of our subjects come from humble circumstances. Shoko Asahara, he was born no different. Born in the Kumamoto Prefecture on March 2, 1955, he was one of just 9 children that his poor mother bore. Poor in this case does have a double meaning. Aside from all that childbirth, they were totally broke. All of their income came from their dad's part-time work as a traditional weaver, which was barely enough to support one man, let alone a large family. But Asahara, at this point still known by his birth name Chizuo Matsumoto, he had an additional disadvantage. He was blind. One eye's vision was completely gone, while the other's was impaired. Shipped off to a state-run school for the blind at only 6 years old, the young boy seemed destined by fate for hardship. Only fate had counted on one thing: Asahara's charisma. Ferociously intelligent, Asahara was noted by his teachers for the almost demagogic sway that he had over other students. His voice was like a weapon, but there was something else that his teachers noted too. Asahara had a violent side. Hurting others, it was something of a game to him. Once Asahara had decided you were the enemy, he would do everything in his power to make you suffer. Despite these early warnings, though, Shoko graduated in 1975 with all the trappings of a deeply ordinary man. He failed the tests to get into law and medical school and settled for studying acupuncture. Relocating to Chiba Prefecture just south of Tokyo, he opened his own practice selling quack medicines. And that was kind of it, at least for a few years. In 1978, Asahara married his sweetheart, Tomoko, and the two settled down to making babies. Even Asahara's conviction in 1982 for selling fake cures couldn't shake how fundamentally boring his life was. However, things were about to get very, very interesting. In the early 1980s, Japan's economy had become the single biggest on Earth. With this expansion came a tidal wave of soulless consumerism. The result of this was a generation of Japanese desperate to locate some meaning in their lives. So beginning around 1980, a whole load of new religions started cropping up to feed the wealthy nation's impoverished souls. And one of these was Agon Shu. A mixture of Buddhism and Hinduism, Agon Shu had been around since 1954, but its popularity exploded when the government recognized it as an official religion in 1981. Like thousands of others, Shoko Asahara was sucked in by its teachings, becoming a devout member. But rather than gaining enlightenment, Asahara gained something even better. He got an idea. Like an American robber baron watching the first piece of railroad track being laid, Asahara divined that new religions were the future. And, well, he wanted a piece of the action. So he left Agon Shu. He engineered a spiritual crisis that allowed him to abandon Tomoko and their children and go to India for 2 years to study religious texts. When he finally returned in 1984, he was ready. In September that year, Asahara founded Aum Shinsen no Kai, quickly renamed Aum Shinrikyo. He changed his name to Shoko Asahara and began handing out leaflets on Tokyo street corners and preaching his new religion. So there's a blind man on a corner shouting about God. Surely the busy people of Tokyo would have just laughed at him and walked on, right? Well, not exactly. Do remember that Shoko Asahara was one of the most charismatic talkers ever born, a guy who could even give Hitler a run for his money. And like Hitler, he soon put his God-given gift to diabolical use. So at this point, we really need to ask ourselves, well, what was Aum Shinrikyo, and what did they believe? Well, it's actually kind of hard to say. Now, officially the religion was a mix of Christianity end times theology, Hindu creation myths, Buddhism, yoga, Nostradamus' prophecies, and, well, apparently whatever else Asahara had lying around. Unofficially, though, Aum had one tenet: making Asahara king. As devised by Asahara, Aum's structure was designed to make him rich, while quickly and effectively brainwashing everyone that the cult got its claws into. Like Scientology, it forced members to pay for access to higher spiritual plane, often making people sign over their entire fortunes. Unlike Scientology, it also put its devotees through extreme pain designed to break their will. Aum rituals, they ranged on a scale of just plain nuts to holy hell, what the hell is going on? Followers were made to drink Asahara's blood and dirty bathwater. They underwent ordeals of being plunged into boiling water to purify their souls, a practice that led to many burns and even one death. Some were locked up in isolation rooms for days on end. Others were force-fed hallucinogenic drugs. Above all this floated the spectre of Asahara, sometimes literally. Followers believed he could levitate for hours at a time and that he was capable of reading their minds. They revered him as a living god, a reincarnation of Christ, Buddha, and the Hindu god of destruction, Lord Shiva, all rolled into some sort of super god. Given how utterly bizarre all of this is, you might expect to hear that Aum attracted a few hundred loonies at best, but oh boy would you be wrong. Asahara, he was a gifted advertiser. He recruited only from the upper middle classes of Japanese society, targeting the well-qualified and rich, giving Aum the aura of an exclusive club, albeit one that would rob you blind. As Aum grew richer, its reach increased, sucking in more of the young and alienated. It helped that 1986 marked the start of the bubble economy when Japan became phenomenally wealthy. Not that Aum was confined to Japan. Influential Russians began to join as the decades dragged on. Even Germans were recruited and an American branch opened. By the late 1980s, Aum was perhaps the biggest of Japan's new religions. Asahara was surrounded by 10,000 devoted followers on compounds that sprawled outside of Tokyo and in skyscrapers rented downtown. Outwardly, he told the public he was a new guru spreading a peaceful message. In private, he told his confidants that one day he would be the king of Japan. As his influence grew, Asahara's bullying ways, they returned. He started forcing Aum members to practice extortion and even kidnapping their own relatives for ransom money. This money was laundered through a network of yoga centers and computer shops that the group established with the help of the Yakuza. In 1989, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government finally granted the religion legal status, even as Asahara began preaching anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and saying Americans must be killed. Some said that Aum had infiltrated the government itself, bending the law to its will. As the sun set on Japan's most hedonistic decade, Asahara was in a pretty good place. He was rich, with the religion worth a cool $1 billion American dollars. He was also worshipped by thousands of people. But that wasn't enough for the poor boy from Kumamoto Prefecture. He wanted to rule millions, and he didn't care if he had to kill to make his squalid dreams come true. It started with her eyes. At 11 p.m. on June the 27th, 1994, Yoshiyuki Kono's wife began complaining of vision problems. The Konos were a typical Japanese upper-middle-class couple living in the leafy Kaichi Heights suburb of Matsumoto, surrounded by doctors and lawyers and judges. That fateful night, though, the security of their expensive neighborhood, it didn't save them. Barely had Yoshiyuki gone to check on his wife than she fell to the ground, suffering spasms and foaming at the mouth. As the salesman panicked, little did he know that all across their street, others were collapsing too, dying before their loved ones' eyes. In all that commotion, no one noticed the van driving quietly away. The van was registered to Aum Shinrikyo. This van Asahara had ordered modified to emit clouds of deadly nerve gas. The 1994 Matsumoto incident killed 8 people and left 500 injured. It was the first major terrorist action by Aum and the first terrorist attack ever carried out with Sarin. But it didn't come from nowhere. Over the last half-decade, Aum had metamorphosed from a mere doomsday cult into one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations on Earth. The rot had started back in 1989, just as Tokyo was recognizing it as an official religion. That February, a young man named Shuji Taguchi had tried to leave the cult. Rather than let him go, Asahara had ordered him strangled to death. Not long after, relatives of all members had banded together to file a police complaint. A young lawyer named Tsutsumi Sakamoto took the case, only to disappear in November along with his wife and their newborn baby. It later emerged that all members had beaten all three of them to death and buried their bodies in a forest. When police investigated, Aum sympathizers on the force destroyed evidence that could have convicted Asahara. By now, Asahara was on his way to becoming a Japanese Charles Manson, complete with a dodgy beard and haircut. But one event was about to send him further into murderous insanity that even Manson could have only dreamed of. In February 1990, Japan went to the polls to elect a new government. Asahara made sure 24 Aum members were on the ballot. This would be the first step in his plan to become king. Once Aum had entered the Japanese diet, there'd be no stopping them. There was just one tragic flaw with this. The public did not like Aum Shinrikyo one little bit. When the results came in, Aum's 24 candidates had scraped together a lousy 1,700 votes. Given Aum had nearly 10 times as many adherents, this was a seriously pathetic outcome. Overnight, Asahara became the laughingstock of Tokyo. Now, in an ideal world, this is where Asahara's story would end. But here's the thing about laughingstocks. Humiliating them is rarely the end. As the oft misattributed quote goes, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And with his dreams of being king shattered, Asahara, he was now ready to fight. He started by modifying his prophecies. He now told followers the world would end following a chemical weapon attack in 1995. Their job? Well, that was to make that attack happen. So Aum changed tack. They began using members who worked in government labs to stockpile botulism and anthrax. They sent a team to Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to collect Ebola. They started selling illegal drugs to fund their activities, hiring the Yakuza to provide the muscle. Within 2 months of the elections, Aum launched their first attack. Using their modified van, the group released botulism into the air outside of the Japanese diet. The attack failed because they used a harmless strain, a pattern that would repeat 2 years later when they tried to spray anthrax over Tokyo from atop a skyscraper. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for their experiments with Sarin. Back in Kaichi Heights, Yoshiyuki Kono called the police, begging them to save his wife. Instead, they arrested him and charged him with using Sarin to kill his neighbors. We can only imagine how Asahara must have laughed to himself when he heard the news. It was 1994, and Aum seemed invincible. In the 9 months between the Matsumoto incident and the Tokyo subway attack, Aum went certifiably insane. By now the group was convinced doomsday was mere months away, that the world was out to get them, and that they needed to act fast to bring about the apocalypse. The tales of that time are so crazy that they'd seem like fantasy if we didn't know that they were true. There's the way Aum set up his own factory dedicated to producing AK-47s, the way they managed to steal plans for constructing tanks and heavy artillery from a military contractor, the way they successfully smuggled an attack helicopter into Japan from Russia. As his army and firepower grew, so did Asahara's boldness. In late 1994, he ordered the assassination of an ex-cultist with VX, the same chemical weapon used by North Korea to assassinate Kim Jong-un's dissident brother in 2017. In February 1995, he had a Japanese official kidnapped and incinerated alive in a specially built oven. That same month, he ordered his troops to summarily execute 9 Aum members he suspected of disloyalty. All 9 were hanged and cremated, with their ashes being thrown in a lake. And believe me, it gets even crazier. In 1993, Aum had purchased a ranch in Australia that was home to a uranium mine. By 1994, they were actively planning to extract the uranium and build a dirty bomb. There's even some evidence the cult planned to attack New York's World Trade Center. In short, Aum in early 1995 was a military fighting force prepared to do battle and die for their leader. With Japanese authorities still turning a blind eye to the group, they could probably have carried out any number of atrocities. But Asahara hadn't forgotten his prophecy. He had said 5 days ago that the world would end with chemical weapons, and he knew how to make it happen. Out on their Australian ranch, cultists for Aum had been testing increasingly deadly types of sarin on sheep. As production moved to their Japanese compounds, the group now had enough of the Nazi nerve gas to kill millions of people. They just needed somewhere to release it to bring about the apocalypse. And that somewhere was, of course, the Tokyo subway. In March 1995, Asahara took 5 of his followers aside, as Kenichi Hiroshi, Toru Toyoda, Masato Yokoyama, Yasuyo Hayashi, and Ikuo Hayashi. listened attentively, their master spelled out his grand plan. In a few days' time, Aum would end the world, and they would have the honor of being Asahara's 5 horsemen of the apocalypse. At 7:30 a.m. on March 20th, 1995, 30-year-old Kenichi Hiroshi got on board the Tokyo Subway's Marunouchi line, headed for Tsukiji Station. A shy young man with a dorky pair of glasses and an umbrella clutched in one hand, no one paid any attention to him as he took a seat and placed a plastic bag on the floor. Shortly before 8 a.m., as the train entered the government district, Hiroshi calmly tapped his umbrella twice, puncturing his plastic bag. He got up and exited, vanishing into the morning bustle. Just another face in the anonymous Tokyo crowd. Across the subway network, Toyota, Yokoyama, and the 2 Hayashis were doing the exact same thing. It never even occurred to anyone to stop them. As Hiroshi's train lurched off to its next destination, someone noticed a funny smell, a chemical whiff. As the train rolled on, commuters trapped inside began to feel ill, to notice their vision going funny. By the time it pulled into the next station, it was clear that something was seriously wrong. At 8:02 a.m., the first alarm went up. On the Hibiya line train, poisoned by Yasuo Hayashi, people were vomiting blood. Others were having fits. As the news of the problem reached the subway authorities, they made a fateful decision. They decided to shut down the affected lines. The result was sarin-filled trains becoming stuck between stations, the people on board trapped like rats in a deadly box. As the gas seeped out to fill first cars, then trains, hundreds of people were poisoned, and then thousands. With nowhere to run, survivors panicked, desperately trying to escape death in those black and claustrophobic tunnels. At one station, 3 subway employees bravely tried to remove a sarin package by hand. Within minutes, 2 of them were dead. As commuters ran for the surface, they brought the sarin with them, it clinging to their clothes. Like a disease, it spread from person to person, poisoning thousands more. Bodies piled up in the streets outside of stations. Paramedics who ran to treat the wounded were themselves affected, their nervous systems attacked by an invisible killer. In that morning's carnival of horrors, many would go blind, many would suffer brain damage, and many would die. It was the bloodiest day Japan's capital had awoken to since the firebombing of Tokyo in 1945. At that moment, it must have really seemed like the end of the world had truly arrived. Luckily, Asahara, he had already sown the seeds of his own downfall. Well, do you remember that whole Matsumoto incident from about 5 minutes ago when Aum poisoned that entire suburb with sarin? Well, Hiroshi Morita had been on the front lines treating that attack and had since become Japan's leading authority on sarin poisoning. When news broke from Tokyo about a mysterious gas poisoning commuters, he immediately put 2 and 2 together. With frightening speed, he frantically called and faxed every single hospital in Tokyo, sending them detailed instructions for treating sarin poisoning. Since sarin can take hours to kill or disable you, it's thought Morita's actions saved many lives. But not all of them. By the time the sun set on Japan's Day of Terror, 12 people were dead. Dozens had been permanently disabled, and somewhere in the region of 6,000 people had been poisoned. 10 years after the attack, it would be estimated that around 30% of those injured were still suffering with the effects of sarin poisoning. One study claimed that 60% of those gassed experienced permanent eye damage. For Japanese authorities, the Tokyo subway attack, it was a wake-up call. There was no longer any doubt that Aum were involved, and no amount of friends in the police could save Asahara now. It was time to take down the cultist. The days after Aum's sarin attack were like living through a dream. Less than 48 hours after Kenichi Hiroshi punctured his bag of sarin, a series of coordinated police raids saw Aum compounds raided and 200 cultists arrested. Facilities for producing sarin, mustard gas, anthrax and Viax were seized, along with enough weapons to start a war. Shocked by the sudden police attention, the cult hit back hard. On March 30th, the head of the National Police Agency was shot and nearly killed by an Aum assassin. 2 weeks later, sympathizers released a cloud of phosgene gas at Yokohama Station, injuring 400 people. But it wasn't until May the 5th that Aum really tried to get their revenge. That morning, a cyanide bomb was left below air ducts in Shinjuku Station. There was enough gas in it to kill 20,000 people. Through sheer fluke, the detonator malfunctioned, and it wouldn't be Tokyo's last near miss. On May the 16th, 1995, Shoko Asahara was finally found hiding inside a fake wall in Aum's headquarters. Although he was arrested, the attacks didn't stop. His 13-year-old daughter Rika was made leader and instituted a reign of shocking abuse and torture that surpassed even her father. That same evening, an Aum letter bomb nearly killed the governor of Tokyo. Finally, on July 4th, 1995, not 4 months after the subway attack, Aum's last gasp came. 4 hydrogen cyanide bombs were left in subway stations across Tokyo. Together, they would have killed somewhere in the region of 100,000 people. But once again, those detonators failed. Broken by repeated raids, their teenage dictator now taken into care, Aum scattered. The group's high-ranking members, they all went on the run, scattering to the 4 winds. The last fugitive member wouldn't be captured until 2012. For Asahara, though, it was the end of the line. His trial began in 1996, just as the once-rich Aum declared bankruptcy. It lasted an incredible 8 years. For the first 4 years, Asahara disrupted proceedings by making long, rambling speeches claiming a miracle would save him. But even his legendary charisma, it couldn't help him now. In 2000, Asahara seemed to recognize this, and he fell silent. He wouldn't speak again for the rest of his life. In 2004, Asahara was finally sentenced to death by hanging. His lawyers failed to file appeals, and in 2006, the sentence was upheld. Not 2 years later, Asahara had a sort of mental collapse. He stopped all contact with his family and followers. He stopped eating unless he was spoon-fed. He refused to use the toilet and instead took to wearing an adult diaper, soiling himself in silence in a gloomy corner of his cell, defeated and forgotten. He stayed like that for the next decade. On July 6, 2018, guards led Asahara from his cell out into the yard alongside 6 other Aum cultists who he hadn't seen for 12 years. It's impossible to know what the other cultists felt seeing him in that moment. Seeing the man who'd once bent them and half of Tokyo to his will reduced to a silent, living corpse. Did they feel remorse? Did they see him for the false gods that he always was? We'll never know. All 7 were hanged that morning, their families only alerted after they were already dead. They were cremated inside the prison, their bodies burned as they'd once burned those of their victims. When news of Asahara's death reached the media, most living outside of Japan kind of just shrugged and were like, who? Yet, even now, his story, it might not be over. In 2000, just as Asahara was falling into his catatonic state, Aum officially renounced him. Breaking into 2 offshoots, the majority renamed themselves Leaf. They set up a fund to compensate Aum's victims and swore to become peaceful. But they never completely succeeded in exorcising Asahara. Today there are around 1,500 Alif members. Journalists report that many still live surrounded by Asahara's teachings, reading his books and decorating their homes with portraits of him. Although under surveillance by Japanese authorities, they continue to worship the cultist who tried to destroy the world. And they're not alone. In 2016, the tiny European nation of Montenegro expelled 58 foreigners suspected of being members of Aum. Although 4 were Japanese, the majority were Russians. That same year, Russian authorities busted 25 compounds operated by the group. Prosecutors have warned that there may be up to 30,000 Russians currently involved with the cult. The BBC has since reported the group operating in Belarus and Ukraine. Shoko Asahara may be dead, but his influence, it clearly remains. While there's no evidence his remaining followers are planning more terrorist atrocities, they still worship the man who once brought Tokyo to its knees. For a man as charismatic as Asahara, it seems his dark legacy extends even beyond the grave. So I really hope you found that video interesting. Hopefully we answered that big who question for you. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below. And don't forget to subscribe. We got brand new videos several times a week. So hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you learn about all of those. If you want something more right now, though, videos linked to on the screen now from the archives. And as always, thank you for watching.